Are on attempt number 5. I'm starting this over intentionally, and not that the facts have changed, and not because new documents have dropped. Instead, it's because when you sit with the same 3 articles long enough, you start to realize that there's a lot of work being done by the tone, almost as much as the facts. I've now read these pieces more times than I can count. The Business Insider profile on Stephanie Jones, the New York Times article that frames the text as bombshell evidence, and the Variety article that quietly explains how that evidence has surfaced. There are other articles, however, those 3 are the ones that end up having a conversation almost amongst themselves inadvertently. And every time I go back and look through them, something else clicks. Not because something new is revealed, but because something that was always there starts to rearrange itself and become more obvious. When 3 major outlets describe the same sequence of events in 3 very different ways, that's not random. That is positioning. But what I want to do here is slow down, walk through each piece, because individually they feel incomplete, but together they all tell a part of a much more complicated story. Let's start with the Business Insider. This is where the narrative actually begins, even though it's not really spoken of that often. Every once in a while it will come about. On the surface, this article looks like a workplace culture investigation, a profile of a powerful publicist, look at what happens when old school PR tactics collide with a newer media environment. But Business Insider never actually decides whether Stephanie Jones and her behavior is acceptable. It's posed as a question. Instead, it does something much more subtle. It presents a series of negative behaviors and then immediately softens them with context, prestige, and proximity to power. We're told that she yells, she intimidates, she FaceTimes employees to test whether they're lying. She doesn't let people go easily. And then almost immediately, we're reminded that she represents Tom Brady, she's trusted by billionaires, she's formidable, and she's old school. Negative, then fluff, negative, then prestige, and that pattern matters. It happens more often than we are aware of. Because this article isn't really asking, is this okay? It's asking, is this the cost of doing business at the highest level? And that's an important distinction. Now, here's the part that should make anyone pause. This is the only article that is like this, especially around this date. There's no follow-up investigation. There's no wave of corroborating profiles, no broader reckoning about toxic workplaces in the elite PR firms. Just one deeply reported piece published in mid-August 2024, right as internal relationships were starting to fracture. That timing matters. I'm not sure what it's saying. That's what I'm questioning. So let's lay out the timeline. In July of 2024, Jennifer Abel gives notice. And in my prior post about Stephanie Jones, I was saying that in my mind, I thought this Business Insider article happened in July of 2024. Instead, we can see here that we've confirmed it happens on August 15th. On August 15th, Business Insider publishes this unflattering, very detailed profile of Stephanie Jones, or so we're led to believe. Days later, tensions escalate. Phones are seized. Legal positioning begins. Now, that was something that was brought to my awareness by someone in the comments, because I hadn't fully gelled in my mind what the timeline was in relation to the release of this article. One of you did a fabulous job of cementing down the timeline even more in the comments and brought awareness to the fact that this is 6 days before Jennifer Abel is called into the office to be fired and her phone and laptop are seized. Now, I'm not saying this article caused anything. What I'm saying is, did it function as a justification? It establishes a narrative of volatility, of paranoia, and control. It created a public record that said, this is just how she is. So when escalation followed, it didn't look shocking. And I guess that's the question that I'm asking. Was this article set up so that it seemed reasonable for somebody to be upset that an article was published like this? And that's why she then takes aim 6 days later at Jennifer Abel. There's a pattern here, and it seems consistent. Patterns matter, especially in this case, especially in how things continue to unfold. This matters when we move to the next piece, because this is where perception broadens and the patterns strengthen. So before I move away from the Business Insider article, I want to show you some of the things that I was noticing, because what happened after I made my post about Stephanie Jones and this article the other day, I was thinking about it, and one of the patterns that happens between Stephanie Jones and Blake Lively is that they are both claiming that these articles and headlines that happened in August of 2024, that they're part of a smear campaign. But I started to think, a lot of the headlines that we've been reviewing in relation to either of these women, I don't really see the smear. Who is this article aimed at? Where is this article published? And who is the audience? The answer is right here. It's Business Insider. So this isn't a magazine that's based on fashion. This isn't a magazine that's about parenting or home life. The audience is going to be business insiders. This starts to look like, is this an ad? Is this actually a part of marketing? Because if you think of the audience of Business Insider as other people in the industry, and when we think of the references that continue to happen throughout this article, there's a lot of power and position that starts to come out of these paragraphs and statements. Because here, the very beginning of this article paints Stephanie Jones in the light of being possibly within or the continuation of a legacy of PR publicists. It talks about Tom Cruise, Pat Kingsley, Bobby Zarum, and how there are previous cutthroat PR representatives who have been very successful working with high-powered professional clients. And then it moves on and brings in Stephanie Jones, attaching her to the continuation of that legacy. There are some things that, again, if you were a lay person and you weren't thinking about seeking a PR specialist, you could look at this and think, oh, terrible, sounds awful to be around. But again, who is this article aimed at? Business Insider is not aiming towards people that typically aren't looking for PR representatives. Business Insider is aimed towards a lot of people who likely at some point are going to face the possibility that they might need a PR representative. And then the other thing that crossed my mind is that I was like, usually when there's a smear, there's usually unflattering photos included. You know, oftentimes when we see other types of articles released about celebrities who the media wants us to think of in a bad light, it's usually a photo of a celebrity that doesn't want to be seen, doesn't want to be caught on camera. Their hair isn't done, their makeup isn't done, they're maybe not wearing clothes that are camera ready. Whereas the photos that are featured in this article are very flattering. We see Stephanie Jones here looking at her client, and she seems to be looking radiant and lovely. The other element that I was noticing that become a pattern later on when we look at the other articles is that it starts to build the status and the position of Stephanie Jones in the industry. It talks about who her clients are, and in that regard, kind of guides us towards a positionality of who Stephanie Jones is in the industry, because she's talking again about her clients. Well, I shouldn't say she is. The article is talking about who her clients are and who she serves. It name drops people like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Scooter Braun. We hear about Jeff Bezos. We hear about these high-powered celebrities who are at the lead in their industries. What we're supposed to believe is a smear about her are things that are saying how explosive she is and how unorthodox she is in her passion in pursuing whatever it is that she's engaged in. This section here in this paragraph, this is one that really made me question And it's why I wanted to come back and revisit this article. You can see here, it says she FaceTimed one employee who called out sick and accused her of lying. And then it softens that statement by saying, turns out Jones was right. And again, if we're looking through the lens of who this article is aimed at, if you're a Jeff Bezos, if you are an industry leader and you are, think of the type of PR things that they are dragged into. If you're a person of that caliber who is looking for a PR representative and you read things like this, she does unorthodox things, but she's not wrong. She pushes the line of appropriate, but she's not wrong. And then you think of all of the things that they get dragged into in the spotlight. Does this tell a story of someone that no one would ever want to hire? Or does this tell a story of the possibility that people of this caliber might want somebody like this in their corner because she's willing to push the boundaries. She's willing to push the limits on behalf of her clients because she might be almost inappropriate, but she's not wrong. The other pattern that we start to see develop in this article is that there seems to be credibility and position building through these types of comments within articles, whether it's about Stephanie Jones or her clients. It seems to be a pattern that she and her agency seem to regularly follow and repeat. And so we see that in this paragraph, where what it does is talks about who she is. So it ties not only the level of clients that she carries, but also talks about how she's married to Jason Hodes, a partner at the talent agency WME. She's serving these high-powered clients, and she's also married to a person who's super relevant in all of these industries and also has a high level of connection and power and prestige in the industry. I don't see where the insult is in this so-called smear article. Just remember this pattern of behavior, that it talks about her position and then also talks about the power and position of her spouse. What I also noticed about the Business Insider article was that this happened on August 15th. I've spoken before in other posts on my other platform about MER campaigns, and nobody seems to be in agreement what the acronym stands for. It's stated in several different ways, but essentially a MER campaign is a pattern of grabbing attention on behalf of a client. And the way that it usually happens is there's several articles that are posted about a celebrity, about a client, that are not polarizing. They could be articles that are about celebrities' favorite food is, or celebrities' favorite new restaurants. And then it's just these types of articles that are about the person, somewhat relatable. They're just almost informational, and they're there to build attention and interest in said celebrity. And then what happens is then there's a spike. They want to spike the attention for this client, for the celebrity. And so there are negative headlines, negative articles that are put out, and it's in order to pique interest of the public. That will go on for a period of time, build the attention of the public. And once the attention is captured, then it will shift into these fluff pieces. There will be headlines and articles that are seemingly humanizing the celebrities. And what it does is it builds connection. It builds the idea that we can see them like, oh, they're just like us. They have struggles just like we do. And it could even be articles about organizations that they're creating, their donations, their humanitarian work, anything to soften the harshness of those prior negative headlines and of being human and flawed and therefore more like us. They struggle just like we do. In that way, gives an off-ramp from the negative attention and builds an on-ramp towards having more compassion for that person, having more sympathy, and maybe even a little bit of forgiveness for what has previously been in the headlines. What I can see is that it was basically August 15th and then August 30th, there's a fluff piece article that was posted. And that one was essentially talking about Stephanie Jones being this elite publicist. And then we move on because the next articles don't come out until December. And the two articles that tie all of this together, the reason why I've even made this post, are the New York Times article and the Variety article. The New York Times comes out on December 21st, and the Variety article comes out on December 23rd. I want to do a quick shout out to docket updates. Carol has been doing an amazing job of keeping up with docket updates, making sure all of the case information is organized and accessible. There's a lot of times where going to docket updates has helped me organize my thoughts and really solidify who's who in here, what's happening on the docket, etc. It's a wealth of information. If you haven't visited docket updates, go find it, click through. And if you are so compelled, if you appreciate Carol, there is a button at the bottom of the page. It's a Buy Me Coffee link. So if you appreciate Carol and her hard work and everything that she's put into the site, go ahead and click that and give her a nice little cup of coffee. Now, the reason why I'm shouting out docket updates is because I'm using their version of the New York Times article. I don't have a subscription. So I can't go to the New York Times website to do a screen share of the article. So I am using what is supposed to be the side-by-side comparison of the New York Times article as it was posted on December 21st versus the current one that we have. Now, because I'm doing a screen share and I have my windows, on half of the screen, it's not going to do a side-by-side comparison. The way that I'm looking at it, the articles are stacked one right over the other. But if you were to go to docket updates and have this window in full screen, you would be able to see the articles right next to each other so that you could compare one to the other and see the changes as they occur. The reason why I'm bringing up the New York Times right now is because the New York Times tells readers inadvertently, in my opinion, that Blake is potentially Van Zandt. There's no distinction between them. The New York Times also tells readers that Blake Lively's filing includes thousands of pages of texts and emails that she obtained through a subpoena. So let's say that again. Let's hear that again. She obtained through a subpoena. And I know that it wasn't until recently that we even caught on to that. It was maybe a couple of months ago. At best, it was 4 months ago. But in reading the New York Times article again, we catch and realize that, and in my opinion, the New York Times inadvertently tells us that Blake Lively is Van Zandt and Van Zandt is Blake Lively. And at first, when you read that little section, it sounds neutral. It sounds procedural. It sounds inevitable. It's almost undetectable to us. But here's the problem. Without that subpoena, there's no case. None of this would have happened. This evidence is not supplemental. It's foundational. And yet the New York Times never asked who the subpoena was directed at, who responded to it, or why this material surfaced when it did. Isn't that fishy? The subpoena is treated like it should have been there. Like it should have happened, like it just happened. And this is where the tone does a tremendous amount of the work. It makes it almost undetectable because by framing the evidence as something that was simply obtained through a legal process, the article sidesteps the agency involved in producing it. It also avoids a more uncomfortable question: why? Why was this evidence needed before deciding whether to file at all? Which brings us to the next article. But before I move on to the next article, which is the Variety article, I want to point out some things in the New York Times article, because again, we are looking at dates, etc., of when these articles were published and some of the patterns that come out of these articles. And again, December 21st is when this is first published. And to give you a better grounding of these dates in your mind, December 21st was a Saturday, which means the CRD complaint was filed on a Friday. And we're talking about the Friday before the holiday week of Christmas. So how many people are actually in office? And I remember when this first came out, I was really baffled as to how they had so much information so quickly the day after a CRD complaint was filed. And the farther out we get from the original release date of this article, the more that we have to question, how did they have so much? How were they able to put together such an incredible wealth of information that usually would take days or weeks, sometimes even months, to put together an article that has all of these details included in it? And so to think that the CRD complaint goes out on Friday and then boom, the next day, because it's published at 10:11 a.m. And remember, this is 10:11 Eastern Standard Time. And because of the time difference between California West Coast and New York East Coast, that shaves off even more of that window for the New York Times to be able to have this ready to go. Because imagine, even if they had the CRD complaint in by 8 o'clock in the morning on Friday in California, that would still put this at least 11 a.m. on the East Coast. So even at the best time that it could have been entered in California for the CRD complaint, that would still put them at 11 a.m. And that would only give only the second half of the business day to get anything cranked out and published the next day, 2 hours after the typical workday starts. That's a really tight turnaround to have so much information. So we've pretty much always known that the New York Times had information before the CRD complaint. We just don't know exactly when. There was speculation about the metadata from the original moment when we were questioning that. I believe that was all the way as early as the February through April era of this case. But we do know that that metadata date stamp refers back to October 10th, 2024. Whether that is factual and cemented down in place, what it does is once we learned about the Van Zandt subpoena, we know that it happens after the Van Zandt subpoena, and that was on September 27th, 2024. So that is an appropriate amount of time for someone to respond to a subpoena, but that's something we'll talk about here in a moment. I'm going to go through the rest of the New York Times article to point out some of the other things that we were noticing. And again, Carol's done a great job of organizing this sort of stuff. So you'll see the things that she's highlighted and then some of the comments that she's put into the margins. This has not changed. This comment here that she obtained through a subpoena has not changed. But what is so important to notice with this statement is it says her filing includes excerpts. It doesn't say that based off of everything from the emails and text messages, this is what happened. It says her filing includes excerpts. So it includes pieces. It doesn't mean it's the sum total of everything that they have. It means it's the result of what they have stitched together, the few pieces that they have taken to stitch together. That is the result. That is the outcome from thousands of pages of text messages and emails. I'm stating that because we're going to visit that later, especially when we get into the Variety article. Now, we continue to go through and we'll get to the patterns that we started to notice in the Business Insider article. And that's what we see happening here in this paragraph. Miss Lively, who is married to the actor and entrepreneur Ryan Reynolds of Deadpool fame and is close with Taylor Swift. That's building credibility and giving context to position. That puts her in a high position and a high status. And they put it in a really flattering way. Entrepreneur Ryan Reynolds of Deadpool fame. They're not trying to paint the picture that she's married to somebody who's small and meek and doesn't have power and position. They're actually attaching her to somebody who is famous, and not just her husband, but her close friend, Taylor Swift. They are associating her with one of the most powerful names in the music industry. So they're giving credibility and positionality by associating her in this way. But it's the pattern that we see in the Business Insider where they are including these connections. The other thing to notice in this article is it mentions, is Blake Lively set to be canceled, as the title of the article from the Daily Mail. I had previously been questioning, why do we think that the Daily Mail article on 8/16 is the catalyst to a lot of what Blake is deeming the PR smear campaign of August 2024? And it wasn't until rereading this after the fact that I was like, oh, because this article points us to that. This is who Stephanie Jones, in my opinion, and Blake Lively, at least Blake Lively's camp, has directed us to look at as being the starting point. And I say this because I did make my prior post where I talked about why did we think that? Because when I was doing a search and I went back through the headlines and was looking for the pattern of information coming out during August 2024, I found that Page 6 had articles coming out between August 6th and August 9th. It was Page 6 with photos from Backgrid. And what we know about Backgrid is usually those are self-directed pop shots. Usually a celebrity will call in and let the agency know, hey, I'm going to be in this area at this time. And then Backgrid will send out or notify the photographers that they usually work with in order to get those photos. And so that's why I was questioning, did Stephanie Jones and Blake Lively's camp set up those opportunities and create those articles? Because what happens with the Daily Mail article is it takes all of those articles and headlines, the content, and regurgitates them. It snowballs them with other accounts of Blake Lively's past and known things that she's been criticized for, and snowballs them all together. And so I was wondering if maybe the Page 6 headlines were kind of a seed for the Daily Mail or potentially Justin Baldoni and Wayfarer. If Stephanie Jones and Blake Lively think or believe that Wayfarer is going to engage in a smear campaign, is it that they had those Page 6 articles put out there kind of as bait, and then Wayfarer's party, what they're doing is trying what Blake Lively's camp claims to be happening is that there's a smear campaign. Was it the bait for Wayfarer to grab those headlines, wrap them all up together? And is that why they're saying that the Daily Mail is the catalyst? They're not pointing us to the Page 6 articles. They're pointing us to the Daily Mail that to me, they did not read as smear campaign material. All of this brings us to Variety. I'll bring up that article. Remember, New York Times came out on December 21st. Variety publishes theirs on December 23rd. New York Times was Saturday. Variety was Monday. From the very beginning, I had questioned, how did New York Times have all of this information so fast? Many of us have long speculated and essentially known that New York Times likely had their information far earlier than they have ever stated or admitted. It wasn't until rereading the Variety article that I realized, oh, Variety must have had more information before they even state or declare that they had the information, because they also have a lot of details and a lot of information ahead of time. So it seems, because of the way that they've written this article. Now, the whole reason why I'm making this post is because of what inadvertently happens between the New York Times and the Variety article. And I'm not sure that either agency realized that what they were revealing when they published these articles. Because again, New York Times said, oh, Blake got these through a subpoena. They didn't say Van Zandt. They didn't say Blake got these through one of her businesses. And they didn't even say who responded. They just said she got this information through a subpoena. And because it seemed so procedural, it almost comes off as imperceptible. It took us so long to notice. It took us so long to look back and realize, like, hey, New York Times inadvertently tells us that Van Zandt is Blake. Now, what Variety does, and again, this is the whole reason why I'm making this post, is there's this one line that honestly reframes everything. That Stephanie Jones is being made a scapegoat for having simply responded to a subpoena. Again, scapegoat for responding to a subpoena. Here's what that quietly tells us. Stephanie Jones was the one who responded to the Van Zandt subpoena. Not unnamed does, not a faceless entity, not some abstract corporate mechanism. Compliance does not mean choosing which text to produce, framing excerpts, or shaping any narrative or emphasis. You don't become a scapegoat unless you are standing at the center. And this is where the California piece also matters, because here's the thing. Before I go into that, what ends up happening between the New York Times and the Variety article is, again, New York Times tells us that Van Zandt is Blake, and Variety tells us Stephanie Jones responded to the subpoena. At the time when we were first reading these, we didn't really understand. We didn't really know that Stephanie Jones was as involved as she is, that we now know that she is. So in hindsight, what was almost imperceptible at the time is now blaringly obvious. And especially considering what we now know about Van Zandt, we almost didn't catch it. And if we hadn't stayed here, if we hadn't continued to go through this information, if we hadn't continued to dig into this case and look at the dockets, we may have never caught these things. We may have never put these things together, which is why it almost worries me. It almost terrifies me to think that this could go to jury, this could go to trial. Because if there's a jury that gets the washed docket, the way that Blake has been trying to construct it, like, don't look at this. Don't look at the whole article. Don't look at everything. Just look at these little tiny pieces that we've now stitched together to make it look like what I'm saying it looks like. This is the other pattern coming out of the Variety article. It states that Friedman has invited Variety to review the complete trove of texts and emails. They were like, come down, you can look at it all. And then it even says, written by his clients with regards to their handling of the campaign, and to come to your own conclusion, I will open it all up to show the complete truth. They aren't saying that, oh, let us show you the pieces that we have stitched together to make it tell the story we want it to tell. They said, open it up, look at everything, because once you look at everything, you'll see the truth that exists. You'll see what is the sum total answer coming out of all of these text messages and emails. Whereas Blake Lively, from the beginning, even telling New York Times, okay, just look at this and look at that, take this other piece, and it's going to prove what I'm telling you. Whereas Wayfarer's like, look at the whole thing. That's not what it says. They aren't constructing this little Lego puzzle of take this piece, and take this piece, and this proves that I didn't do anything. They're saying, look at the whole thing. It doesn't say what she's saying. And they even told Variety 2 days after the CRD, 2 days after the New York Times article is published, we aren't afraid of you looking at everything. We aren't afraid of you seeing everything. Whereas Blake Lively's camp, they've had everything sealed. They've had everything redacted. They've had, if it's not sealed and redacted, they're sanctioning. They don't want anyone to have the full picture. They just want anyone who looks at this, who they want to believe Blake, they only want them to see the little bits and pieces that they've pulled together. This article says, Jones' attorney countered that she is being made a scapegoat in the affair for having simply responded to a subpoena. The New York Times tells us Blake is Van Zandt. Variety tells us Stephanie Jones responded to the subpoena, even though the subpoena was going after 10 Doe defendants. Well, how do we know that Stephanie Jones is attached to the Doe defendants? Why is Stephanie Jones attached to the Doe defendants? Because here's the thing. If you think of the wording in the Van Zandt document, Van Zandt is saying that the 10 Doe defendants are employees of or contracted by, essentially being contract workers for Blake. Why is Jones Works ever needed if they are Blake's employees or contracted employees of Blake? Why does she need Jones Works? Just a question for you, just to think about that. Okay. Before we go away to the rest of the information that I want to talk about in relation to the Variety article, I do want to point out the pattern that we saw happen in the Business Insider and the New York Times article, and how it plays out in the Variety article, because we see the same pattern, but it's applied in a different way almost, okay? What it does is mention that Jones, again, is married to Jason Hodes, who's a part of WME. It's almost like you can see them setting up the dominoes. They're setting up the dominoes in the Business Insider, then the New York Times, and now they have the Variety article, and that's where they dump the dominoes over. Because what they do is, Jones is married to Jason Hodes, a partner at the talent agency WME, which reps Lively and her husband Ryan Reynolds. So now it's not just about giving them position in society. It's not just about building credibility. What it's doing is it's showing that there's an alliance. It's showing that there is connection. It's showing that there is vested interest amongst this group, that they have an intimate relationship with one another. It's strengthening who they are and how they're connected. And then following this part, it says, WME also represented Baldoni, but dropped him as a client after the complaint was filed. That's where they push the domino over, because now they're outcasting Baldoni. In a way, in a very subconscious way, what they're painting the picture of is that Baldoni doesn't belong. Jones' husband, Lively and Reynolds, none of them want him here. WME agrees. They are painting an image to help us, to help the audience accept that he's not wanted, he should be outcasted. It's removing his position. It's removing his credibility. Does anyone see that? Now, there's some other juicy bits in the Variety article that lay some groundwork that we also maybe didn't know that we should have been looking for when this article was published, because it also tells us Lively's team filed the complaint with the California Civil Rights Department. The state agency can either launch its own investigation or issue a right to sue letter. It tells us an answer that a lot of people have been questioning for a very long time, because I believe Mandy is one of the ones who I've seen a post from, where she was saying she's talked to attorneys who work in employment law, and they were saying it's not typical for complaints to be made public, and especially not that quickly after they've been filed. And I think in her post, what she was also saying is that they then believe, not Mandy, but the people that she spoke to, the professionals, they were saying that they believe that the CRD complaint that was given to the New York Times, that was actually, and even the one that was filed and made publicly available, that it was curated. It was specifically written as a PR piece in order for it to have power and impact in articles and headlines, and to go out into the news and media world in order to fight in the court of public opinion, not in the court of law, not in the CRD process. And so this article basically tells us that, yeah, it's not usual for CRD complaints to be publicly available. It's not usual for us to know this information. Now, the other thing that the Variety article tells us is that California law does allow for pre-litigation discovery in certain circumstances. This is where the California piece matters. California allows pre-litigation discovery, which means you can seek evidence before you've decided whether you even have a case, whether you even want to take something into the court. That is not available everywhere. Not every state has this. So the California filing wasn't about convenience. It was about access to evidence that did not yet belong to a formal complaint or court case, which means the theory came after the evidence, not before, which kind of answers the question about why was there still a fishing expedition on August 29th, meaning why was Claire Ayub used to reach out to Steve Sarowitz to get a recorded call? Why were they trying to find out, are we going to court? Are you taking us to court? Are you suing us? So they didn't even have a real concrete idea or really know that they even had a case or what the case was going to be about. They were still trying to figure out, as late as August 29th, what are we doing? I don't know what we're doing. And so potentially what this also means is that by the Van Zandt filing, they still were like, I don't know what we can say. I don't know what evidence I have. Which, again, if we're talking about sexual harassment, you would have your evidence. You would have the evidence of the events that actually happened, which means the PR smear campaign, all of that. When did that come to fruition? When did that suddenly become a thing? Who thought of that idea and who pushed that out into the world? That inversion matters. Now, let's zoom out and look at how these three articles essentially knit together. Business Insider gives us motive, background, and reputational framing. Then the New York Times gives legitimacy, moral authority, and public weight. And right behind that, Variety gives mechanics, timing, and quiet admissions. Inadvertently. I don't think that either of these meant to do that. And to this point, based off of the things that we have read and the things that we know, I don't see anything that's being dishonest. I don't see anything out of those three articles that we can't corroborate from the documents that are out on the docket currently. They just don't ask the same questions. And when you line them up, something else becomes noticeable. Justin Baldoni, Jamie Heath, and Wayfarer are never described as afraid of what they did. There are no messages. There's nothing saying, I hope she doesn't tell anyone about what I did. I hope she doesn't talk about that thing that happened. I hope she doesn't tell anyone about what we did. Those kind of statements don't appear, ever. What does appear is fear of what What does appear is fear of what Blake Lively might say. Not tied to a specific incident, not tied to an event, not tied to a moment, just fear of narrative. And there's a big distinction that matters there, because fear of a narrative is not the same thing as fear of exposure. It's fear of framing. So the question becomes, where did this escalation actually begin? If pre-litigation discovery exists to determine whether a case should be filed from a third party with their own evidence, if pre-litigation discovery exists to determine whether a case should be filed and the evidence came from a third party with their own grievance, then the most important question is not what the texts say. It's who decided when they matter. I want to be very clear here. I'm not claiming hidden villains or secret masterminds. What I am saying is that the public story we were told about how this unfolded does not match the sequence revealed when you line these three articles up and look at them carefully. This did not begin where we were told it did. And once you see that, it becomes very hard to unsee. I'm asking the questions. Do you see the same patterns that I'm seeing? Do you see other patterns that we haven't been paying attention? And are there other questions that you can think of in relation to this case that maybe I haven't asked? So thank you. I will see you when the next thing hits the docket.